He thought humiliating his wife on their wedding day would be his ultimate power move, but when she flips the script with a revenge so stunning it goes viral, the whole world watches as he gets exactly what he deserves. The Grand Hall of the St. Regis Hotel in New York was nothing short of a dream, a breathtaking space adorned with thousands of white roses, towering crystal chandeliers, and golden accents that reflected the wealth of the man at the center of it all. The guests, a mix of business tycoons, socialites, and celebrities, sipped champagne as they eagerly awaited the wedding ceremony of Alexander Kingston, the heir to a billion-dollar real estate empire. At the end of the grand aisle stood Eleanor Hart, a woman of elegance and poise, dressed in an exquisite designer gown. She was breathtaking, yet her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the bouquet of white lilies. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, yet something in her gut told her otherwise. Alexander, standing tall and exuding effortless charm, adjusted his cufflinks as his best man, Julian, nudged him playfully. "Still time to run if you change your mind," Julian teased with a smirk. Alexander chuckled, his eyes glinting with something unreadable. "Oh, trust me, I'm not the one who's going to run," he murmured. The music swelled and Eleanor took a deep breath before stepping forward, her steps steady despite the nervous energy coiling in her stomach. She had loved Alexander since the day they met, and while their courtship had been fast, she had believed in the fairy tale, until the last few weeks when things began to shift. His texts became shorter, his touches more distant, and the warmth that once filled his eyes had turned into something colder. Still, she had convinced herself it was just wedding stress. Now, standing before him, she prayed she was right. The officiant began the ceremony, speaking about love, commitment, and devotion. Eleanor listened intently, her heart swelling with hope, but as she turned to face Alexander, she noticed the faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Her stomach twisted. When it was time for the vows, Alexander took a deep breath and then, with an exaggerated sigh, turned toward the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice loud and clear, "before we go any further, I have something to say." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's heart pounded. This wasn't part of the plan. Alexander turned to her with a faux sympathetic smile. "Eleanor, you're a lovely woman truly. But let's be honest, this was never really a love story, was it? You wanted the Kingston name, the wealth, the prestige, and I needed to settle down for the sake of appearances." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Was this some kind of joke? The room was dead silent. Alexander chuckled, looking around at his audience. "I mean, come on. Did any of you actually believe this was a real love story?" He shook his head. "Eleanor is beautiful, yes, but let's not pretend she isn't here for the money. And frankly, I've decided I don't feel like being used today." Gasps filled the room. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The humiliation was suffocating. "Alex," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. "What are you doing?" "I'm making a choice, darling," he said smoothly, stepping back. "And that choice is, this wedding isn't happening." Eleanor could barely process what was happening. The room was spinning. The guests were whispering, some even laughing, as the realization of the spectacle dawned on them. A woman in the crowd, whom Eleanor recognized as one of Alexander's ex-flings, let out a delighted chuckle. "This is better than a soap opera," she murmured. Tears threatened to spill, but Eleanor swallowed them down. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Unbelievable," she said under her breath, her voice steadier than she expected. Slowly she turned and faced the sea of guests, their faces a mix of amusement and pity. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to disappear. But then, something inside her hardened. She had a choice. She could leave in disgrace, or she could take back her dignity. With a deep breath, Eleanor straightened her posture, lifted her chin, and took the microphone from the officiant's stunned hands. "Since my dear fiancé seems to believe this wedding is a joke," she said, her voice calm but cutting, "let's set the record straight." Alexander arched an eyebrow, clearly amused. Eleanor turned to the crowd, the corners of her lips curling into a smirk of her own. "You see, Alexander here thinks he's in control, that he can humiliate me and walk away unscathed." She shook her head with mock sympathy. Poor thing, he never quite understood who he was dealing with. The guests leaned in, intrigued. "Here's something you might not know," Eleanor continued, her confidence growing. "The Kingston Empire? That untouchable, invincible family name, it's hanging by a thread. A murmur of confusion swept through the audience. Even Alexander's smug expression faltered. Eleanor turned toward him, her eyes gleaming. "Darling, did you really think I didn't know about the financial crisis your company is facing?" She let out a soft laugh. "You needed this marriage more than I did. This was never about love, not for you. It was about saving your image, securing investors, and keeping up the illusion of power." The color drained from Alexander's face. Eleanor stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough for only him to hear. "The only problem?" she whispered. "I knew exactly what you were doing, and I was always 3 steps ahead." She turned back to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to formally announce that this wedding is indeed over," she said, flashing a dazzling smile. "But not for the reason Alexander thinks." Eleanor reached into her bouquet, pulling out a neatly folded document. "As of this morning," she announced, "I have officially withdrawn my investment from Kingston Enterprises." A collective gasp filled the room. Alexander stiffened. "You're bluffing." Eleanor arched a brow. "Am I? Perhaps you should check your emails." Julian, who had been smirking beside Alexander the whole time, quickly pulled out his phone. The moment he read the notification, his face paled. "She's telling the truth," he muttered. Panic flickered in Alexander's eyes for the first time that evening. Eleanor smiled sweetly. "I may have loved you once, Alex, but I am no fool. You wanted to embarrass me. Congratulations. But in doing so, you lost the only thing keeping your company afloat." Alexander clenched his jaw, his arrogance replaced with something else. Fear. Eleanor turned on her heel and strode confidently toward the exit, pausing only to glance back at him one last time. "Enjoy your downfall, darling," she said with a wink. With that, she walked out, head held high, and within hours the world would know exactly what had happened. Eleanor stepped out of the grand ballroom, the air outside crisp against her flushed skin. Every step she took away from that disaster of a wedding felt like a small victory, yet the sting of betrayal still lingered deep in her chest. She had just been humiliated in front of hundreds of people. No, the world. Yet she refused to let Alexander have the last word. Her hands trembled slightly as she hailed a cab, slipping into the back seat before the media frenzy could explode outside. "Where to, miss?" the driver asked, eyeing her wedding gown in the rearview mirror. Eleanor exhaled slowly, collecting herself. "The Lexington Tower, please." The driver nodded and pulled into the heavy evening traffic, oblivious to the storm brewing behind him. She stared out the window, the city lights flashing past as her mind replayed everything that had just happened. The laughter, the gasps, the look on Alexander's face when she revealed her trump card. It had been risky pulling her investment at the last second, but she had known for weeks that Alexander planned to publicly humiliate her. He had been too careless, too sure of himself, and that arrogance had made him predictable. What he didn't know was that Eleanor had prepared for this moment the second she overheard him talking to Julian at his office. "She's perfect for the act. I mean, look at her. Elegant, poised, well-connected. She'll give the impression that I'm settling down, and that's what investors love. But actually marrying her? Please, this is just an expensive PR stunt." The words had burned into her memory, igniting a fury she had never known before. Eleanor had been blindsided. She had loved Alexander, trusted him, but instead of breaking down, she had done something far more dangerous. She had planned her revenge, and now, as the cab sped through the city, she was ready for the real fallout to begin. Alexander stood frozen in the middle of the grand ballroom, the once celebratory atmosphere now drenched in awkward silence. The whispers from the crowd grew louder, journalists already composing their headlines, guests subtly backing away as if his downfall were contagious. Julian, usually smug and full of wit, was pale. "Alex," he muttered under his breath, "tell me this is a joke." Alexander clenched his fists. "She's bluffing," he growled, forcing himself to regain control. He refused to believe Eleanor had the audacity or the power to pull her investment so suddenly. But then his assistant Mark stormed into the room, his face filled with panic. "Sir, we have a situation." Alexander turned sharply. "Handle it." "You don't understand," Mark insisted, lowering his voice. "Eleanor's investment was tied to the largest expansion project in Kingston Enterprises. Without it, the entire development collapses. And the board, they're already discussing emergency options." Alexander's stomach dropped. He had counted on that investment to stabilize his company's finances, to keep shareholders confident. Eleanor hadn't just embarrassed him. She had strategically destroyed the safety net he had built. The murmurs in the room turned into open conversations, people pulling out their phones, reading the latest news updates. Eleanor's announcement had spread like wildfire, already making headlines across business and social media platforms. Kingston Enterprises loses multi-million-dollar investment. What's next for the heir? Runaway bride or power move? Eleanor Hart exits wedding and business partnership with a bang. Did billionaire Alexander Kingston just get outplayed? His chest tightened. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Julian rubbed his temples. You absolute idiot, he hissed. Why the hell did you have to make a spectacle of it? We could have handled the breakup discreetly. But no, you had to play the big man and humiliate her in public. And now? Now she just turned your entire company into a joke. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, his composure slipping for the first time in years. Julian wasn't wrong. And the worst part? Eleanor had walked out with her dignity intact. He, however, was left scrambling for damage control. Eleanor stepped into the penthouse suite of Lexington Tower, dropping her bouquet onto the sleek marble countertop. She pulled the veil from her hair, tossing it aside as she poured herself a glass of red wine. She was exhausted, not just from the event itself, but from the sheer emotional weight of it all. Her phone buzzed. Unknown caller, she smirked. That was faster than I expected. Answering, she didn't bother with pleasantries. Good evening, Alexander. A tense silence stretched across the line before his voice came through, tight with frustration. Eleanor, we need to talk. She sipped her wine, leaning against the counter. Do we? Because I distinctly remember you making it very clear that we had nothing to discuss when you humiliated me in front of hundreds of people. Damn it, Eleanor. She interrupted, her tone sharp. You don't get to play the victim here. You did this to yourself. And now, you're reaping the consequences. You knew, he accused. You knew I was going to end it at the altar. Eleanor tilted her head, feigning innocence. What can I say? I'm not as naive as you thought. Alexander exhaled harshly. Do you have any idea what you've done? The board is furious. Investors are panicking. You just cost me? Exactly what you planned to cost me, she cut in. Only I beat you to it. There was another pause before Alexander spoke again, his voice eerily calm. This isn't over, Eleanor. She smiled. Oh, I know, it's just getting started. With that, she hung up. By the next morning, the entire business world was talking about one thing, Eleanor Hart, the woman who had walked away from one of the most powerful men in the country with her dignity, reputation, and influence intact. Articles praised her intelligence, her ability to outmaneuver Alexander in his own game. Female entrepreneurs reached out in support. High-profile executives took an interest in her, and the stock market reflected the consequences of Kingston Enterprises' sudden instability. Eleanor sat back in her office, watching the news unfold with satisfaction. Her assistant Claire walked in with a knowing smile. Miss Hart, your inbox is flooded. Business proposals, collaboration requests, even an invitation from Forbes for an exclusive interview. Eleanor smirked. Perfect. Alexander had played his game. Now it was time for hers. And unlike him, she never lost. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the glow of the morning sun casting long shadows across her office. The night had been restless, but not in sorrow. Rather, it had been filled with the rush of victory, the satisfying knowledge that she had outmaneuvered a man who had thought himself untouchable. Her inbox was overflowing with emails, congratulatory messages, business proposals, and media inquiries. It was almost comical how quickly the narrative had shifted. Yesterday she had been a humiliated bride. Today she was being hailed as a strategic genius. She scrolled through the headlines. Eleanor Hart, the woman who took down a billionaire in one move. Savvy or savage? How Eleanor Hart played the ultimate business power move. The wedding that became a corporate battlefield. Her lips curled into a smirk as she set her phone down. Miss Hart, Claire, her assistant, stepped in. There's been a significant increase in stock movement this morning. Some of the top firms are shifting their investments away from Kingston Enterprises. Eleanor arched a brow. Interesting. Also, the media is pressing for an official statement, particularly Forbes and the Financial Post. They're framing this as more than just a failed engagement, more like a corporate shakeup. Eleanor tapped her nails against the desk. She had expected media buzz, but she hadn't anticipated just how eager the business world would be to turn this into a war. Send a polite decline to all interview requests for now, she decided. Let them speculate. It makes the story more intriguing. Claire nodded. And Alexander? Eleanor's smirk deepened. What about him? He's already in meetings all morning. I heard through contacts that his board is panicking. The lack of investment security is hitting them hard. Good, Eleanor said simply. Claire hesitated. There's something else. Julian reached out. At the mention of Alexander's right-hand man, Eleanor's expression turned cold. What did he say? He wants to talk. No details, just that he insists it's urgent. Eleanor exhaled through her nose. Julian was as arrogant and cunning as Alexander, but she knew that if he was reaching out, it meant something was seriously wrong on their end. Tell him I'm busy. Claire grinned. Will do. As her assistant left, Eleanor turned her chair toward the window, looking out over the city skyline. She had thought she would feel emptiness after all of this, but instead she felt a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about power. Alexander sat in the conference room of Kingston Enterprises, his jaw locked tight as he listened to his senior executives argue. The room was a mess of raised voices and tension, and every single one of them was looking at him for a solution. This is catastrophic, one of the board members said, throwing down a printed article onto the table. Our stock took a dive overnight, investors are backing out, and the media is tearing us apart. You've turned this company into a joke, Alexander. Alexander clenched his fists beneath the table. We will recover. This is temporary instability. Temporary? Another executive scoffed. Eleanor Hart was our strongest investment partner. The moment she withdrew, it sent a message to the rest of the market that we're unstable. If you don't fix this, we're looking at long-term damage. And let's not forget the public damage, another added. You didn't just lose a business deal. You made a spectacle of yourself, Alexander. Your name is being dragged through every media outlet. You're being called a fool, a misogynist, a man who let his arrogance destroy his own empire. Alexander felt a muscle tick in his jaw. He had built Kingston Enterprises into a powerhouse. He had maneuvered through ruthless deals, played cutthroat games, and always emerged victorious. But now, because of Eleanor, he was being forced to play defense. Julian, sitting quietly at the end of the table, finally spoke. We need to get her back. Alexander turned sharply. What? Julian met his gaze evenly. You need to fix this. Publicly, business-wise and personally. Whether you like it or not, Eleanor now holds the cards. If you don't get her back on our side, this company is going to bleed out. The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled in. Alexander hated the truth in them. That evening, Eleanor attended a high-profile gala event, one she had originally planned to attend with Alexander as a power couple. Now she walked in alone, but not unnoticed. Photographers snapped pictures the moment she stepped onto the red carpet, their flashes blinding as they scrambled to capture the woman at the center of the business world's latest controversy. She was draped in an elegant, sleek black gown that accentuated her commanding presence. Her chin was lifted, her stride confident. If anyone expected to see a broken woman, they were about to be sorely disappointed. Miss Hart, a reporter called out as she walked past. Do you have any comments on your split with Alexander Kingston? She gave a poised smile but didn't break stride. No comments at this time. Inside, the room buzzed with power and wealth. Industry giants, socialites, and investors mingled in conversations that shaped the economy. Eleanor grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, making her way toward a familiar face. Lillian. She greeted the CEO of Windsor Financial, one of the most influential women in the industry. Eleanor. Lillian smiled, intrigued. You've certainly made waves. Eleanor sipped her champagne, her eyes twinkling with amusement. So I've heard. Lillian studied her. And what's next for you? Because from what I see, you hold far more leverage than you did yesterday. Eleanor hummed. I have a few ideas. Before Lillian could respond, the energy in the room shifted. Eleanor sensed it before she even turned. Alexander had arrived. He walked in, his presence commanding as always, but his usual arrogance was subdued. There was tension in his frame, a flicker of something dark in his expression as he scanned the room, until his eyes landed on her. Eleanor raised her glass slightly in mock salute, his lips pressed into a thin line. He moved through the crowd with calculated precision, stopping in front of her. The conversations around them quieted as people pretended not to listen. "Eleanor," he greeted, his voice low. "Alexander." She returned smoothly. "You've made quite the statement," he said, tilting his head slightly. She arched a brow. "Oh? I thought you were the one who made a statement at the altar." "I merely responded." His jaw clenched. "You and I need to talk." Eleanor took another sip of champagne. "About what? The public humiliation? The business implosion? Or the fact that you're just now realizing that I'm not someone you can discard so easily?" Alexander exhaled, clearly restraining his temper. "Privately, Eleanor." She let the moment stretch, reveling in the fact that for once, he was the one on the back foot. Then, with a small smirk, she set down her glass. "Lead the way, then." As she followed him toward a more secluded part of the event, Eleanor felt the quiet thrill of victory. He thought he was here to negotiate. What he didn't realize was that she had already won. Eleanor followed Alexander through the grand ballroom, her gaze steady, her steps deliberate. She felt the subtle shift in energy, the hushed whispers, the lingering gazes of the city's elite watching as the once powerful couple now stood on opposite sides of a war. He led her through a side door into a quiet, dimly lit lounge reserved for VIP guests. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and a grand piano sat in the corner, untouched. The sound of the gala faded behind them, leaving only the weight of unspoken words between them. Alexander turned to face her, his sharp gaze meeting hers. "You've made your point," he said, his voice low, controlled. Eleanor smirked. "Have I? I thought I was just getting started." His jaw clenched. "You wanted revenge, you got it. Now tell me, what do you really want, Eleanor?" She tilted her head slightly as if considering his question. "Oh, Alexander, you always assumed I wanted something from you. But the truth is, I never needed anything from you. I only wanted respect." His lips pressed into a thin line. "And ruining my reputation was your way of earning it?" Eleanor let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "I didn't ruin your reputation, Alexander. You did that all on your own the moment you decided to humiliate me in front of the world. I simply let everyone see you for who you really are." Alexander took a slow step forward, his presence as imposing as ever. "You think you've won, Eleanor? This isn't over." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I know it's not over. Because I know you, Alexander. You're not the type to accept defeat easily, and that's exactly why this is so satisfying." His expression darkened. "You've hurt my company." Eleanor leaned back against the plush leather sofa, crossing her arms. "No, you hurt your company. Investors don't pull out just because of a wedding scandal. They pull out when they lose faith in the man running it." His hands curled into fists at his sides, but he remained silent. She had a point, and they both knew it. A tense silence stretched between them before Alexander exhaled sharply. "So what now? Do we keep playing this game until we both burn everything to the ground?" Eleanor considered him for a moment, then said, "That depends. Are you ready to acknowledge that you were wrong?" His eyes flickered with something unreadable. "I made a mistake." Eleanor laughed, shaking her head. "A mistake? Alexander, you didn't forget an anniversary or miss a dinner reservation. You stood in front of hundreds of people, millions online, and treated me like disposable trash. You orchestrated that humiliation. That wasn't a mistake. It was a choice." His gaze darkened. "And you want me to grovel?" Eleanor smirked. "Oh no, I don't expect groveling, but an actual apology. That would be nice." Alexander exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. This was uncharted territory for him. He was used to negotiating billion-dollar deals, manipulating markets, controlling every aspect of his life. But now, he was losing control. And worse, Eleanor was the one holding the reins. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice quieter this time, "for what I did, for how I treated you." Eleanor studied him carefully, searching for any sign of insincerity. But for the first time in their long, complicated relationship, she saw something real, a flicker of regret. She nodded, accepting his words, but not letting him off the hook just yet. "Good. Now let's talk business." Alexander frowned. "Business?" She straightened, her expression turning all business. "You have a company to salvage, Alexander, and you know as well as I do that the only way to regain investor trust is through strategic alliances." His gaze sharpened. "You're offering to work with me?" Eleanor smirked. "Not exactly. I'm offering you a lifeline, a temporary alliance, one where I call the shots." He scoffed. "You expect me to just hand over control?" She leaned forward, meeting his gaze head-on. "I expect you to listen for once in your life. You need me, Alexander. And whether you like it or not, I hold the leverage now." He studied her for a long moment, his mind racing through the possibilities. He hated admitting she was right, but he also knew that fighting her would only lead to further destruction. Finally, he let out a slow breath. "Fine, let's talk terms." Eleanor smiled. "Now that's more like it." The next morning, Eleanor sat in her office, scrolling through the latest business reports. Kingston Enterprises was still struggling, but their partnership announcement had already begun stabilizing investor confidence. She glanced at her phone, seeing a text from Alexander. "Alexander, dinner tonight, no business talk, just us." She hesitated for a moment, then typed back, "Eleanor, we'll see." As she set her phone down, a small smile played on her lips. The game wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, she was playing to win. Eleanor sat in her sleek office, the morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her firm's headquarters. The city stretched out before her, but her mind was far from the urban skyline. Her inbox was flooded with messages. Investors, reporters, business analysts, all trying to make sense of the unprecedented partnership between her company and Kingston Enterprises. She took a sip of her coffee, scrolling through the headlines. "Scandalous wedding humiliation leads to business alliance, power move, or desperate gamble." Eleanor Sterling's stunning comeback from disgraced bride to power player. Alexander Kingston faces uncertain future. Can he rebuild his empire? A smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. The world was watching, waiting for the next move, and she had every intention of making sure she remained 3 steps ahead. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. "Alexander, we need to talk, my office, 1 hour." Eleanor let out a short laugh, shaking her head. If he thought he could order her around like one of his employees, he still had a lot to learn. She typed back, "Eleanor, I have meetings, you'll have to wait." A response came almost immediately. "Alexander, cancel them, this is bigger." She hesitated for a moment. As much as she hated to admit it, she was intrigued. Something about the tone of his message felt different, urgent. After a moment of deliberation, she sighed and typed back, "Eleanor, fine, I'll be there in 2 hours." She let him sweat a little. 2 hours later, Eleanor stepped into Kingston Enterprises, walking through the grand glass entrance with the same confidence she had when she first met Alexander. The receptionist greeted her with nervous respect, quickly leading her up to his private floor. The doors to his office swung open before she even knocked. Alexander stood by the window, his suit impeccable as always, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. He turned when she entered, his gaze sharp and assessing. "You're late," he said. Eleanor arched an eyebrow. "I told you 2 hours. If you thought I'd show up a minute earlier, that's on you." His lips twitched, but he didn't take the bait. Instead, he gestured toward the chair in front of his desk. "Sit." She didn't. Instead, she leaned against the edge of his desk, crossing her arms. "So what's so urgent?" Alexander ran a hand through his hair, his expression unreadable. "There's a problem, a big one." Eleanor tilted her head. "Go on." He hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching into his desk drawer and pulling out a file. He handed it to her, watching closely as she flipped it open. Her stomach tightened the moment she saw the contents. A series of reports, financial discrepancies, internal communications, and one name that stood out among them all, Richard Weston. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the file. "You're telling me your CFO has been embezzling money from the company?" Alexander nodded. "For the past year, carefully, subtly. Just enough that it wasn't obvious at first, but with the media storm after the wedding, everything got scrutinized. That's when I started digging deeper." Eleanor closed the file, exhaling slowly. "So why are you telling me this? This is your mess to clean up, not mine." Alexander's jaw tensed. "Because he's not just stealing from me. He's trying to make sure you take the fall for it too." Eleanor stilled. "What?" Alexander walked around his desk, his voice low and controlled. "Before the scandal, I signed a few joint investment agreements with Sterling Global, standard procedure. But when I looked at the records, I realized Weston had funneled money through those agreements, making it look like your company was involved in the fraud." Eleanor's eyes flashed. "That bastard." Alexander smirked slightly. "That was my reaction too." She took a deep breath, regaining control of her emotions. "All right, What's the plan? Alexander studied her for a long moment before saying, "We take him down. Together." Eleanor arched an eyebrow. "We?" He leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "Like it or not, our businesses are connected now. If Weston succeeds in pinning this on you, both our reputations take the hit. We need to move fast before he can cover his tracks." Eleanor considered him for a moment. She had spent years building her empire from the ground up, and she wasn't about to let some corrupt CFO drag her down. But teaming up with Alexander again? That was dangerous territory. Finally, she sighed. "Fine, but we do this my way." Alexander smirked. "I'd expect nothing less." That evening, Eleanor sat in her private penthouse, staring out at the city skyline as she sipped a glass of wine. This was a dangerous game. Her entire life she had been underestimated, first by her ex-husband, then by the business world that assumed she wouldn't recover from public humiliation. Now she had a chance to prove everyone wrong. Again. A soft chime broke the silence. A new message from Alexander. "Alexander, dinner tomorrow night. We need to strategize." Eleanor smirked, shaking her head. "Eleanor, business only." His response was instant. "Alexander, of course, liar." She set her phone down, her smirk widening. This was going to be fun. Eleanor arrived at the restaurant the next evening dressed in a sleek black dress that exuded power. She wasn't here to play games. This was business, and she intended to keep it that way. Alexander was already seated at a private table in the dimly lit, exclusive venue. The restaurant was one of the most expensive in the city, a place where billionaires and power brokers met to make deals in the shadows. He stood as she approached, ever the gentleman despite his past mistakes. "Right on time," he remarked, pulling out a chair for her. Eleanor sat without acknowledging the gesture, crossing one leg over the other. "I don't have time for pleasantries, Alexander. Let's get to work." His lips twitched, but he nodded. "Straight to business, then." He slid a folder across the table. "I had my team dig deeper into Weston's accounts. Turns out he's been funneling money not just through our investments but also offshore. He's setting up a quiet exit plan." Eleanor flipped through the documents, her sharp gaze scanning every detail. "This means we have enough to take him down. The question is, do we expose him publicly or quietly remove him?" Alexander leaned back in his chair, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Publicly." Eleanor arched a brow. "Bold move." Alexander smirked. "That's the only way to ensure he can't slip through the cracks. If we handle it quietly, he'll find another company to exploit. If we make an example of him, no one will trust him again." Eleanor considered his words before nodding. "Agreed. But if we're doing this, we do it smart. We need a controlled leak, enough to force his hand but not enough for him to escape before we have him cornered." Alexander's eyes gleamed with approval. "Already ahead of you." He gestured toward a discreet security team stationed near the entrance. "I've been tracking his movements. He's dining here tonight." Eleanor's eyes flicked across the restaurant, scanning the patrons. And there he was, Richard Weston, sitting 2 tables away, completely oblivious to the trap closing in around him. Eleanor smirked. Perfect. They executed the plan flawlessly. As Weston sipped his wine, a subtle buzz filled the restaurant. Phones lit up with notifications as an anonymous leak hit the financial press, detailing the massive fraud, the offshore accounts, and his attempts to frame Sterling Global. Weston's face paled as he scrolled through the articles, his hands shaking. The moment his phone rang, Eleanor knew it was over. Alexander casually approached his table, sliding into the chair across from him. "Richard," he said smoothly, watching the man squirm. "Rough night?" Weston swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Alexander and Eleanor, who now stood beside the table, arms crossed. "What did you do?" Weston hissed. Eleanor smiled. "Just leveled the playing field." Alexander leaned in. "Your accounts are frozen, your offshore holdings are flagged. The SEC is launching an investigation." He took a sip of his drink, his voice turning almost sympathetic. "Now you have 2 choices, Richard. Try to run and end up in a cell, or cooperate, sign a full confession, and maybe, just maybe, you'll get out of this with something left." Weston's breathing turned ragged. "You can't do this." Eleanor leaned down, her voice soft but deadly. "We already did." Within hours, Weston resigned in disgrace, his confession making headlines across the country. Sterling Global and Kingston Enterprises emerged from the scandal not as victims, but as the masterminds who had uncovered the fraud. strengthening their reputations rather than tarnishing them. Eleanor sat in her office the next morning, sipping her coffee as she watched the news unfold. She had won. Again. A notification buzzed on her phone. "Alexander, we make a good team," she smirked, typing back. "Eleanor, don't get used to it." But even as she sent the message, she couldn't ignore the feeling in her chest, the undeniable truth that for the first time in years, she had met her match. Eleanor leaned back in her leather chair, staring at the news article on her computer screen. Richard Weston resigns amidst financial fraud scandal. SEC investigation underway. Every major outlet had picked up the story, turning Weston's downfall into the biggest corporate scandal of the year. Commentators debated his legal future, business analysts speculated on the impact, and shareholders scrambled to distance themselves from him. It was exactly the kind of public disgrace she had envisioned. A knock on the door pulled her attention away. "Come in," she called. The door opened and Samantha, her ever-efficient assistant, stepped inside with a satisfied smirk. "I thought you'd like to know. Weston just booked a one-way ticket to the Cayman Islands." Eleanor chuckled. "Coward." Samantha nodded. "SEC already flagged his departure. He won't make it through the airport before they detain him for questioning." Eleanor exhaled slowly, closing her laptop. "Good." Samantha hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Alexander Kingston is here to see you." Eleanor's brows lifted slightly. "Send him in." Samantha stepped aside as Alexander strode into the office, looking as effortlessly composed as always. He had that infuriating smirk on his face, the one that suggested he enjoyed pushing her buttons just a little too much. "You know," he mused, glancing around. "I expected some kind of celebration. Champagne, balloons, maybe even a victory dance." Eleanor folded her arms. "You're mistaken if you think I celebrate over something as predictable as Weston's downfall." Alexander chuckled, dropping into the chair across from her desk. "Ah, yes, the ever-ruthless Eleanor Sterling, always 5 steps ahead, always calculating." His gaze softened slightly. "You did well." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "Of course I did," Alexander smirked. "And yet, you're still frowning." She hated that he was perceptive, because he wasn't wrong. Weston was finished. Sterling Global was stronger than ever. Everything had gone according to plan. So why did she feel unsatisfied? Eleanor straightened in her chair. "What do you want, Alexander?" He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "A proposition." Eleanor scoffed. "Not interested." Alexander grinned. "You haven't even heard it yet." "I don't need to." His eyes gleamed with amusement. "You will." She sighed, gesturing for him to continue. "Weston's mess left a power vacuum in several key markets," Alexander explained. "Sterling Global has the reputation. Kingston Enterprises has the reach. Together we could dominate industries Weston failed to manage properly." Eleanor leaned back, watching him carefully. "And what do you get out of this?" He shrugged. "Aside from a highly profitable partnership, the pleasure of working with the most ruthless, brilliant woman in the business world." Eleanor's lips twitched. "Flattery doesn't work on me, Alexander." His smirk widened. "I know, but it's true." She considered his words. It wasn't a bad idea. In fact, it was a great idea. Their companies had always been competitors, but this would be different. A strategic alliance that could make them untouchable. But working with Alexander Kingston meant constantly dealing with his insufferable confidence, his relentless teasing, and his uncanny ability to read her. Eleanor wasn't sure she was willing to let that happen. She exhaled, tapping her fingers on the desk. "I'll think about it." Alexander grinned. "That's all I needed to hear." He stood, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. "In the meantime, don't work too hard, Eleanor." She scoffed. "I'll work exactly as hard as necessary." Alexander chuckled, heading for the door. "I'll be waiting for your call." Eleanor watched him leave, shaking her head. She hated that he intrigued her, and she hated that he knew it. Eleanor sat alone in her high-rise office, staring out at the city skyline. The setting sun cast an amber glow over the skyscrapers, painting the glass and steel with streaks of gold. From this vantage point, she could see everything: the empire she had built, the world she had conquered. Yet for the first time, victory felt hollow. Richard Weston had been stripped of everything: his power, his wealth, his reputation. Sterling Global was thriving, stronger than ever, and she had positioned herself as one of the most influential women in the business world. and yet there was a lingering sense of unfinished business. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up without looking at the screen. Yes? A familiar voice answered. Enjoying your view? Eleanor rolled her eyes. Alexander, you sound disappointed. I don't have time for whatever game you're playing. Alexander chuckled. Oh, but you do. You're staring out of your window, contemplating something deep and existential, wondering why victory isn't as sweet as you expected. She clenched her jaw. You think you know me so well. I do, he said smoothly, which is why I know you're not finished yet. Eleanor exhaled, pinching the bridge of her nose. Weston is done. There's nothing left to finish. Alexander's voice was laced with amusement. You and I both know that's not true. You didn't take him down just to win. You took him down because he wronged you. And that means you don't just want him to lose. You want him to pay. Eleanor remained silent, her grip tightening around her phone. Alexander continued, his tone quieter now. He's trying to slip away. He still has money stashed in offshore accounts. He's already reached out to international investors, hoping to rebuild under a different name. The man doesn't know how to stay buried. Eleanor felt a familiar fire ignite in her chest. That bastard. He was supposed to be ruined, not recovering. Send me everything you have, she said coldly. Alexander chuckled. I already did. A notification appeared on her screen, an encrypted file. She tapped it open, scanning the documents, bank transactions, emails, conversations with lawyers. Weston had been careful, but not careful enough. Eleanor smirked. I knew you wouldn't let this go, Alexander said. She leaned back in her chair, savoring the moment. Oh, this isn't about me. It's about making sure people like him never get the chance to rise again. I couldn't agree more, Alexander replied. So, how do you want to handle this? Eleanor tapped her fingers against her desk, thinking. She could leak the documents to the press, expose Weston's plans before they could gain traction. Or, she could go directly to the authorities, make sure he never set foot in the corporate world again. But neither of those options seemed satisfying. This needed something bigger, something that would destroy him. Her eyes flickered to a framed photograph on her desk, one of her at a charity gala, shaking hands with the governor. Connections, influence, power. Weston had always been untouchable because of the people he knew, the politicians and businessmen who had protected him. But Eleanor had her own network, and unlike Weston, she wasn't about to lose. She turned back to the phone. I need a meeting with the governor, tonight. Alexander let out a low whistle. Going for the kill shot, huh? Eleanor smirked. I don't do half measures. I'll make the call, Alexander said. And Eleanor? What? Remind me never to cross you. She smiled. Smart man. The governor's private office was as grand as expected. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, expensive leather chairs, a mahogany desk that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Eleanor sat across from the governor, her expression unreadable. I assume you didn't request this meeting for small talk, Governor Whitmore said, pouring himself a glass of bourbon. No, Eleanor said coolly. I came to talk about Richard Weston. Whitmore's hand paused mid-pour. What about him? She slid the file across the desk. He's attempting to rebuild. Offshore accounts. Undisclosed partnerships. He's already laying the groundwork for his comeback. Whitmore exhaled sharply, setting down his drink. Damn fool doesn't know when to stay down. No, he doesn't, Eleanor agreed. Which is why I need your help making sure he stays buried. The governor leaned back, studying her. And what's in it for me? Eleanor smirked. Re-election funding, public support, and the chance to take credit for taking down one of the biggest fraudsters of the decade. Whitmore tapped his fingers against his desk. And what do you get? Eleanor's expression hardened. Justice. The governor considered this for a long moment, then reached for the file, flipping through the documents. After a few minutes, he nodded. I'll have my people look into this. Consider it handled. Eleanor stood, extending her hand. Pleasure doing business with you. Whitmore chuckled, shaking her hand. You're a dangerous woman, Eleanor. She smirked. And don't you forget it. 2 days later, the news broke. Richard Weston indicted on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. Arrest warrant issued. Eleanor sat in her office watching the broadcast. Weston's mugshot flashed across the screen, his face pale and defeated. Her phone buzzed. Alexander. She picked up. Remind me never to get on your bad side, he said. Eleanor smirked. I already did. He chuckled. Drinks tonight, we should celebrate. She leaned back in her chair, considering. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. She had won, completely. Drinks sound good, she admitted. Alexander laughed. I'll pick you up at 8. Eleanor ended the call, setting her phone aside. She glanced at the city skyline one last time before turning away. She had spent years fighting, years seeking revenge. And now she was free. Eleanor arrived at the private lounge, the air thick with the rich scent of aged whiskey and expensive cigars. The place was quiet, exclusive, exactly the kind of setting where the elite conducted business in hushed tones over top-shelf liquor. Alexander was already waiting for her, leaning casually against the bar, a glass of bourbon in hand. You're late, he teased as she approached. Eleanor smirked, sliding onto the stool beside him. I had a city to destroy. Alexander chuckled, taking a slow sip. And destroy it you did. Weston's finished. His name's a stain on every business journal, and his allies are scrambling to distance themselves. She swirled the amber liquid in her glass, watching it catch the light. Good. Alexander studied her, his gaze sharp. You should be happier about this. I am, she said simply. And yet there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something unresolved. Alexander sighed, setting his drink down. You're thinking about him. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a measured sip, letting the warmth settle in her chest before answering. He called me. Alexander's brows lifted slightly, but he didn't look surprised. Did you answer? No. A long silence stretched between them. Eleanor exhaled slowly. He left a message, said he wanted to talk. Alexander shook his head, his expression darkening. You don't owe him anything. I know, she admitted, but I want to hear what he has to say. Alexander scoffed. Let me guess, he's sorry. He was blinded by ambition. He didn't mean to humiliate you in front of the entire world. She didn't answer, because deep down she knew that was exactly what Weston would say, and yet curiosity gnawed at her. What if I meet him? She murmured. Alexander frowned. Why? Eleanor stared into her drink. Because I want to look him in the eyes and see if he's truly broken. Alexander exhaled sharply. You don't need that. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Maybe I do. The next day, Eleanor agreed to meet Weston, not in some private hotel suite or discreet office, but in a public setting, an upscale cafe, where every table was occupied by business professionals and socialites, sipping their overpriced lattes. She wanted witnesses. She arrived first, sitting at a quiet corner table, her posture composed, her presence commanding. Minutes later, Weston walked in. He was a shadow of the man he once was, the arrogant, untouchable businessman who had once humiliated her in front of a sea of flashing cameras, was now gaunt, his once pristine suit slightly wrinkled, his gaze lacking the same ruthless glint. He looked defeated. He hesitated when he saw her, then made his way over. Eleanor didn't stand. She didn't offer a polite greeting. She simply lifted her coffee cup to her lips, watching him. Weston sat across from her, exhaling shakily. You actually came. She tilted her head slightly. What do you want? Weston's fingers curled into fists on the table. He was clearly trying to maintain composure, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. He paused, swallowing hard. I needed to see you. Eleanor arched a brow. Why? His eyes flickered with something, regret, shame, desperation. I know I don't deserve your time, or your forgiveness, but I needed to say this to your face. She waited. Weston inhaled deeply. I was wrong about everything. Eleanor remained unmoved. Be specific. He let out a bitter laugh, rubbing a hand over his face. I was arrogant. I was selfish. I thought humiliating you would make me feel powerful, like I had control over my own life. She tilted her head, watching him with cold amusement. And did it? Weston's expression twisted. It destroyed me. Eleanor leaned back, crossing her legs. It destroyed you because you lost, not because you regret what you did. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked away, ashamed. Eleanor smirked. You didn't think I'd see through that, did you? Weston sighed, looking down at his hands. I don't expect you to forgive me. He met her gaze, his voice softer now. I just needed you to know that I regret it. Silence stretched between them. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, then set her cup down. I don't hate you, Richard. Weston looked up, startled. She smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was triumphant. I just don't care about you anymore. Weston flinched. Eleanor stood, grabbing her purse. Good luck with the rest of your life, you'll need it. And with that, she walked away, leaving him sitting there, powerless. For the first time in years, Richard Weston truly understood what it meant to lose. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt free. Eleanor walked out of the cafe, stepping onto the bustling streets of the city, where people hurried past, oblivious to the life-altering confrontation that had just taken place. The crisp air filled her lungs as she let out a deep breath, releasing the last remnants of whatever hold Weston had on her. For years, she had carried the weight of his betrayal, the public humiliation, the whispered gossip that followed her everywhere she went. But now, as she strode down the sidewalk with unwavering confidence, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Light. She had won, not because she had crushed him financially, not because she had turned his life into a living nightmare, but because she no longer cared. She reached her car, sliding into the sleek leather seats, her fingers gripping the steering wheel as a triumphant smile played on her lips. She had come full circle, from the woman scorned, broken, and humiliated, to the woman standing tall, untouched by the ghosts of her past. Her phone buzzed beside her. She glanced at the screen. Alexander. Eleanor picked up, putting him on speaker as she started the car. Tell me you didn't kill him, he teased, his voice laced with amusement. She laughed softly. Number, but I did something worse. Alexander chuckled. Do I even want to know? She smirked, pulling onto the main road. I told him I don't care anymore. There was silence on the other end, then a slow exhale. Damn, Alexander murmured. You really are something else, Eleanor. She grinned. I know. Eleanor spent the next few weeks closing out the last of the business dealings tied to Weston. Every contract, every shared investment, every legal loophole that had once kept them entangled. Gone. She didn't just walk away from him, she erased him from her life entirely. Meanwhile, Weston tried desperately to salvage what was left of his career. He reached out to former business partners, old allies, anyone who might be willing to help him climb back up. But no one wanted to be associated with a man who had lost everything. His humiliation had become a cautionary tale in elite circles, a reminder that power could crumble at the hands of the wrong woman. And Eleanor? She flourished. With Weston out of her way, she launched a new business venture, one that embodied everything she stood for. Strength, independence, resilience. Investors lined up to work with her. Former rivals now sought partnerships, admiring the way she had not only survived but thrived. She became more than just a name in high society. She became a legend. One evening, as she stood on the balcony of her new penthouse, overlooking the shimmering city skyline, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She had come so far, endured so much, and now she stood on top of the world, completely untouchable. Her phone buzzed again. Another deal, another opportunity, another step toward an empire that was solely hers. Eleanor smirked, stepping back inside, ready for whatever came next. Because this was just the beginning. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Would you have handled this situation differently? Subscribe for more powerful stories that prove karma always finds a way. Always finds a way.